So with that, without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. And you'll see that I feel like I knew who my audience was with this original this photograph here on the cover, a golden cheek warbler for Travis Audubon, one of our iconic state birds and endemic breeders to the hill country here. Slide over. All right. So here are the faces of Audubon, Texas. This is some of the leadership. And you've met Suzanne, you've met me, but you're not meeting tonight. And critical partners to in our organization are Scott Moorhead, the Director of Policy, and Alexis Baldera, the Coastal Program Manager, and John Reynolds, our Communications Manager. So these are some of the faces. Everybody that you're seeing up on the screen right now has a tenure of about less than 2.5 years. So Audubon, Texas has a relatively new face, but some very strong leadership. I'm very proud to serve shoulder to shoulder with these colleagues on the work that we're hoping to achieve. And I'll further like to kind of just provide a little overview. I know we have probably a pretty diverse audience right now.
Hey, Romey.
Yes?
Sorry, this is Nicole. We can't see your screen. Will you share it with us?
How's that?
There you go. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let me go back to the screen before. And just so you can see very quickly some of the faces I was talking about. So there are the faces of Audubon, Texas, and I briefly introduced them: Scott Moorhead, Alexis Baldera, our Coastal Program Manager, and John Reynolds. And I'll go ahead and flash forward now, and we'll talk briefly about some of the hierarchy of Audubon. Audubon, Texas sits as a division of Audubon National, which is differentiated from many of the distributed chapter network. We have about 20 chapters throughout Texas. On this map, you can see most of them labeled, and their distribution throughout the state. You can also see that we have several sanctuaries up in North Texas, and we have the Sable Palm Sanctuary. But we're headquartered now out of Austin. We moved about a year ago from Dallas to Austin. Let's now talk about what makes Texas so special, and this is one of my favorite things. You'll discover a few things about me. That first, I'm a biophile. I love all life. I'm a cartophile. I love maps, and I'm a bibliophile. I love to read, and I especially love to read about natural history of Texas. Up first, you'll see a map of the geophysical provinces of the United States. And on this map, you'll see illustrated that, that there are these major ecoregions and geophysical regions of the United States, and they all sort of converge on Texas. You'll notice from the southeast that we have the coastal plains, and then peeking into the Dallas and the Cross Timbers area of North Texas are the central lowlands. We have great amount of Great Plains influence within central Texas and the Panhandle, but we also see some basin and range influence in far west Texas. And by the way, I think it's interesting that this can also be indicated by some of the forest associations that we see. Many people don't know that Texas is the only state within the United States where you can see both western and eastern pine and oak forests. You can take a look in the state, you can dial in, and you'll note that we have about 12 ecoregions. So there's a wide diversity. We're sitting here within the Edwards Plateau of central Texas, about here, right? And in Travis County, we see the influences of the Edwards Plateau in the east. We have the Blackland Prairies and post-oak savanna habitat here. And again, we're seeing the convergence of many different ecoregions in a small area, which is providing some unique circumstances that we'll jump to in just a minute. And then I also like to always point out that Bexar County probably has the most diverse arrangement of ecosystems, with four different ecoregions converging within the county. If you look at our vegetation map, it looks like a kid got loose with a pack of crayons and just started coloring all over the place. We have 46 different vegetation covers if you consider urban one of them. And what is a bit of trivia I just learned about that over here near Andrews County, Texas can claim the largest contiguous oak forest in the world. And you might be thinking like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, Romey. I've been out there, it's all sand. Well, the oak forest is composed of Havard shin oak, which does not grow beyond 4 feet. And so it's rather short, but it is a contiguous coverage of over 40,000 acres. And you can see a good example of that in Monaghan's Sandhill State Park. Moving along, I just talked about some of the unique vegetation that occurs within Texas. So what you're looking at is a picture of Texas barberry. This is endemic to a few counties in the hill country of Texas, meaning that it's found nowhere else in the world. And we have quite a few endemic species within the state. We'll talk about a few more here in just a moment. One of the characteristics that provides some more opportunity to see a diversity across the state is that we have over 350 miles of coastland at 0 feet in elevation. But we go all the way to the west and we can find ourselves at over 8,700 feet at the tip of Guadalupe Peak in the Guadalupe Mountains. Interestingly enough, Texas has 10 peaks over 8,000 feet, all occurring within the Guadalupe and Davis Mountains. And then also a fascinating tidbit is that the Davis Mountains range includes over 800 square miles above 1 mile in elevation. That's roughly 1/3 of the entire county of Jeff Davis County where the mountains occur. Here we see a wide variance of rainfall that occurs across the state with a general trend of more rain to the east and less rain to the west. However, if you'll note that in the west, you can see that there are these mountains these mountain ranges in far west Texas that receive a bit more rainfall than the surrounding deserts. And so that's why a lot of times these mountain sites are considered sky islands in a desert sea because they can support more and diverse, a completely different assemblage of species unique to those systems. So I just showed you many characteristics that indicate that Texas is extremely diverse, and why, mostly through maps. And I wanted to share some personal experiences that I've had to sort of illustrate the point that Texas just brings together and culminates on all of these unique characteristics to present just these really wonderful dichotomies, or unique dichotomies as I call them. So for instance, in the photograph that you see here is a yellow-throated warbler. Most of us are pretty familiar with this species. We know that it's primarily an eastern distributed species. This is its breeding range that I'm circling here on the range map. We know that they like to breed here in central Texas, primarily along the wooded river bottoms and creek bottoms. But in this photograph, and I was for a long time wrongly calling this the stem, and apologize for that, guys. I gotta go back here. I was wrongly calling this an ocotillo branch, but I believe now, after taking a closer look at this branch, that it's actually leather stem. But I would say that, here I have a photograph of a yellow-throated warbler on an ocotillo branch. The ocotillo branch is an indicator species of the Chihuahuan Desert ecoregion of far west Texas and northern Mexico. And that was a unique observation I had, because this bird is on territory. He's singing territorially. He's on a breeding site, and is known to breed at this particular site. And this unique observation occurred right here on the Devil's River. I believe I was either at the Del Norte unit of Devil's River State Natural Area or on Dolan Falls when I had this observation. But I think it's just a wonderful indication that there are these fingers of sort of eastern woodland forest supported by these rivers running through a desert, that suck in this eastern distributed species and keeps it there breeding year after year. I've also had some other occurrences like this where standing in a single place, a single point in space, I observed in a short period of time a barred owl, which is a decidedly eastern distributed species. You can see this map that I got Austin starred here. This is easily an eastern distributed species, the barred owl. And the next bird I saw was a varied bunting, which if you look at the Texas range map, at least, it's a very western distributed species. And again, I've got Austin starred there for reference in case anybody's having difficulty seeing these maps. But then, just moments later, I see this guy, Morelet seed eater, singing on territory. And this is, if you're looking at the range map there, a decidedly southern distributed species with most of those observations that are coming out of eBird associated with Mexico. And all of this occurred in one day in a short few minutes, just a wonderful assemblage of species representative of completely disparate regions, all at one point in Valverde County at San Felipe Creek. I'd love, a lot of folks know that I love the bird. I'm a big birder, but I'm also a herp guy. I love snakes and reptiles and actually do this sort of stuff in my spare time. And I've noticed a little historical trend here that you can play the same game with some snakes. So this is a timber rattlesnake, and it is an eastern distributed species. Here we have black-tailed rattlesnake, a western distributed species. And then this is a Texas indigo snake, a southern distributed species. All three of these species have been found in one county in Texas, Bexar County. Now, timber rattlesnake may be extirpated from Bexar County now. There's been a lot of development around there, but there are historic records for timber rattlesnake in Bexar County. And again, so completely different wildlife representing different regions of the state or even the country converging in Texas at a single place. And just so you know, we also we see those black-tailed rattlesnakes up around Government Canyon State Natural areas still to this day, quite a few there. And then we're getting Texas indigo snakes down at our Mitchell Lake Audubon Center in southwestern or southern Bexar County. Overall, and based off of a nature search study from the early 2000s, Texas ranks as the second highest, the state with the second highest species diversity overall, and that would include vegetation too. We have the third highest rate of endemism in the state, or in the country, meaning that there are, that these are species that occur nowhere else in the world except within the boundaries of the state. So you can imagine that Hawaii is always probably going to have a firm hold on that number one rank, because most of the species that occur there evolved there and they occurred nowhere else. We do fall behind California both in the highest number of species and we're right behind them in number of endemics as they rank number two. But we are considered first in bird and reptile diversity. I know there's some back and forth between the state checklist for California and Texas. I believe that that California benefits from more vagrancy than we do. However, I think if you rank species that use the state regularly, whether for breeding, wintering, or migration, that Texas would rank well ahead of California. And then we also rank second in the number of mammal and plant species in the United States. This map sort of illustrates the bird biodiversity and the importance of Texas relative to the United States in bird biodiversity. And this map is lifted from biodiversitymapping.org. Anybody wants to check in on that. We play the same game with reptiles. And you can see that Texas is just lit up in reptile diversity. And this is a map that illustrates, so there was a study performed several years ago that sort of ranked and prioritized the most important regions within the United States to preserve the United States biodiversity. So what areas do you focus on conserving and investing within to safeguard and assure the greatest amount of biodiversity that's represented in the United States? And there you see that there's a lot of warmth and a lot of attention paid to the Southeast and the Sierras and California to the west. But away from those two regions that are clumped, Texas is the only other priority region, and that region is right here on where we sit in Central Texas. And if this didn't finish the ranking at rank 9, I'm almost certain that rank 10 would be this red dot over at the representative of the Davis Mountains in West Texas. Texas surely has a number of conservation challenges, but so does the world, really. And I think that I think it became really evident for our groups when last year the 3 billion birds report was released, indicating that between 1970 and now that we have approximately 3 billion less birds compared to the baseline of 1970 today. And that's approximately one in 4 birds gone. Some of the assemblages or some of the groups of these birds are hit harder. This doesn't hit across all of the assemblages the same. You see that introduced species are hit significantly with a little over 63% loss, and that's probably a lot to do with their presence within urban landscapes and associations with those little predators that we keep in our houses, but also let outside often with house cats. But we're seeing a lot of the other assemblages going down too, and significantly due to different pressures. You'll note there that some groups have actually gone up, and we'll jump into that a little bit more in just a moment. Some of the hardest hit and the ones that we're focusing on, at least that we think a lot about within Audubon, Texas, or in particular, are those grassland birds. There's been overall, the entire grassland assemblage has seen a 53% loss across all of the species. That is not insignificant. We have seen a decrease in eastern forest birds, approximately 18 or 17% of those birds. And we're seeing a pretty good ding on migratory birds with about 28% of those birds. The populations are about 28% smaller than they were historically. But we have some conservation successes to talk about in that same period relative to birds. We know that waterfowl have increased about 56%. Raptors have gone up significantly. And we also note that the woodpecker assemblage has increased incrementally. And those are, all for various different reasons. The waterfowl have certainly benefited from wetland protection efforts over the last 50 years. And then also that there is a viable and significant funding source with the hunting model that is poured into sustaining those programs that are preserving wetlands. Raptors probably benefit most from some of the regulation with mostly with the use of DDT. We all know that story. And then woodpeckers are benefiting from the recovery of forests, logging practices, and urban forests becoming mature forests, creating snags for them to do their work within. If we look at some of the plans that exist, and I'm going back to the NatureServe study from 2002, we note within that NatureServe study that it lists about 10% of all species within Texas at some level of, at a level of significant risk, and including 2.9%. I think that would capture your endangered and threatened species, or at least your IUC red listed species. So these are the most imperiled. However, we have a newer plan that's been provided for us by efforts made by Texas Parks and Wildlife and a large stakeholder pool, including many experts. that have identified 1,300 total species of greatest conservation need within the state of Texas alone. Across the United States, the same planning all states that have performed has listed 12,000 species of greatest conservation need across the entire United States. Texas has 1,300, and 110 of those species are birds. That's not a small number, and that basically represents about 20% of all of our regularly occurring species within the state. You might ask, well, Romey, what is a species of greatest conservation need? And I would point out that it does, species of greatest conservation need does include your threatened and endangered species, but it's going to include a lot of other species that, as time has passed, their populations have started to decline at some level. And we identify a species of greatest conservation need as a species that has kind of shown a trend of decline for a period of time that makes us concerned. And the reason we want to identify it here instead of here is because the cost of intervention is a lot cheaper here. You don't have to evoke regulatory burdens. You don't have to have big fights among stakeholders, but that you might be able to do good work through volunteer efforts and sound investments and incentives, especially with private landowners. So the reason we identify species of greatest conservation need is to provide a list of wildlife and habitat that they depend upon that need interventions or even more information, so that we can address it when it's most cost effective. And I jumped through here and I kind of switched gears a little bit to talk a little bit more specifically about birds. And a lot of times folks will ask you, you know, why is it important to conserve a species? And everybody has a different answer. I mean, sometimes I just answer because we know them, because we have a relationship with the wild others, so we have a responsibility to them, and especially because we're largely at fault for the negative impacts towards them. But if you want to really jump into some important points that may resonate better with some folks, you can talk about the economic value of pollination. Now, we don't benefit necessarily from a lot of bird pollination in Texas or the United States, but there are some countries that do, and it's a significant amount. Seed dispersal, certainly within some of the montane forest of the Rockies, they're benefiting from seed dispersal from birds. Insect control, I don't think it's deniable that purple martins are considered farmers' best friends. They're certainly ours here, eating up the mosquitoes. So they're providing pest control services that have a dollar value associated with them. Nutrient cycling. I mean, if the vultures weren't out there doing their work for us, I think we would not be real happy with the circumstances of our road, neighborhoods, and there would probably be a lot of nasty water out there. A lot of these bird species are actually prey items for species higher up on the hierarchy. So they serve as important prey sources for predatory birds and other wildlife. There's certainly an ecotourism economy in Texas. We know that we have about 2.2 million people that identify as birders, and that there is approximately a $2 billion economy associated with the ecotourism industry in Texas. So this is not insignificant. We know that birds can provide inspiration. If you've ever peeked into early American poetry, you're going to often find reference to hermit thrushes, and you're going to find reference to mockingbirds as these sing-song and sometimes ethereal haunters of the deep forest where folks sought to receive inspiration. And undoubtedly, birds serve as a mirror of ecological health for us. I have just described a lot of things that we consider ecosystem services, and a lot of these things can have dollar values tied to them. But most importantly, I think the birds that we keep track of on the landscape provide a mirror of our ecological health. And the ecological health, it's undeniable that our communities are tied to those tied to the landscapes around us, whether it's for clean water, flood control, clean air. There's a number of services provided, and the birds are a great indicator of how those landscapes are faring. Now I'll kind of pivot into the work that Audubon does within Texas, Audubon Texas, and illustrate a couple of specific tools and programs that we have and are using and are further developing to implement conservation interventions across the state. First off, I always like to point out, because this is important to me personally, and I'm very glad that this is the way that that Audubon works, is that our planning is led by science, it's informed by science, and it's always a good way to go. It gives us a strong foundation to lead from. Audubon works within 5 strategic categories of conservation. From left to right, we're talking about working lands, which is basically all of Texas. Coasts, we have plenty of coasts in Texas, lots of water. We work on climate issues, and we also work within a strategy called bird-friendly communities that we can think of largely as urban ecology and urban conservation. I'd like to jump in a little bit further on working lands for the first part of this part of the talk. And I'd like to talk about this report that has guided a lot of my strategy development and has provided a strong basis in science for developing strategies of intervention within the state. So the North American Grassland and Birds Report was a months-long effort by Audubon National and the states to determine the impacts and the trends of grassland species, grassland bird populations, and to try to get a handle on the declines that we're seeing. We also wanted to understand the status and threats of the important grasslands of the continental United States. And we further wanted to understand the climate vulnerability associated with those grasslands. The report further dives into prioritization. So where can we invest conservation resources to be most efficient and effective? And then it outlines some of our thoughts around responses or tools available to address that. And one of the tools that I'll dive into a little bit more deeply here is Audubon conservation ranching. You'll see 2 maps here. The map on the left is some of the modeling that came out of this report that assesses climate risk and changes in land use looking forward and into the future, and how important the total grasslands that are analyzed are to the bird species, the grassland obligate bird species of the Great Plains here. And what you see here is that there's a lot of emphasis put on the darker green, lighter green areas as being critically important for those birds. And I believe that report analyzed 39 species. And then the map on the right here illustrates sort of the thinking that has occurred historically associated with the grassland priority conservation areas. So those purple and yellow areas are grasslands that were identified by experts as being really important grasslands for conservation, but that was more due to the risk of land use change or vulnerability. Whereas the map on the left looks at some of the climate impacts on top of land use changes. So we took those 2 ways of thinking within this report and created a consensus priority, which is illustrated by the map here on the left. And it identifies a good chunk of the arid grasslands of West Texas as being of priority importance. Some of the area around the coastal grasslands north of Houston and some of the coastal prairie And then that super sensitive band of blackland prairie, which we know is one of the most imperiled ecosystems in the United States. And the map here on the right sort of shows how Audubon has thought about where it wants to engage, where it wants to focus its efforts in collaboration with all the other great conservation organizations that are working on grasslands issues. These are the ones that we're calling out nationally. And you see a good amount of that focus occurring within Texas, which has focused our work and let us know that we need to step up in a major way to help address those challenges to those species and to take advantage of the opportunities that we have here in Texas. And so we've developed a market-based approach as one of our tools to address grassland conservation. We call it Audubon Conservation Ranching. The purpose of Audubon Conservation Ranching is to serve as a catalyst for the large-scale, landscape-scale grassland restoration and conservation that is important to declining bird species by working with the landowners that operate agricultural operations on those rangelands. So we seek to work with producers of beef and cattle that eventually hit the shelves at supermarkets. And the way we do this is to partner with a private landowner that operates a beef production operation, and to work with them to implement a management plan for that property that calls for holistic grazing practices and restorative grazing practices that hopefully improve the range conditions, or at minimum sustain the good range conditions if a ranch is already well managed. And in return for that commitment, Audubon allows the landowner to place an Audubon Conservation green seal on their beef at the end of the process. So when you go to the supermarket, or if you go online and order some grass-fed beef, and you might be able to find a product with this green label. And the idea there is that by tapping into our network of millions of conscientious consumers out there, that we empower those consumers to engage in conservation through the choice of their purchase of grass-fed beef. And if we can drive demand, then we provide a financial incentive for the landowner to continue commitment through this program. We have, across the United States, enrolled 72 ranches so far in this program, and there's the green seal up there on the top left. We have 72 participating ranches representing over 1.8 million acres. Now you're starting to talk about continental and landscape scale conservation. 33 of those ranches are fully certified. That means they've gone through all of the certification process. So in addition to implementing a habitat conservation plan that's consistent with their operation and bottom line, but also with the needs of the ecosystem and the birds that rely upon it, they are additionally committing to humane treatment of their animals and processes. This is all monitored third party and audited annually. So this is a program that's tried to be as thoughtful as possible, and in addition to that, the animals are raised whole life cycle on these rangelands, certified rangelands. So for it to be able to receive the label, the whole life cycle of the animal has to have occurred on a certified ranch. Texas has, I'll jump to that next. We have 12 states that have ranches enrolled, and we have partnered with at this point, over 45 restaurants, retailers, and institutions in 8 different states to supply this grass-fed beef on the to be available on the market. In Texas, you see a series of dots here, and the bigger dots represent bigger acreage. We have five ranches that have been have gone completely through the onboarding and certification process. We have 14 additional ranches in the pipeline. This is a program that's beginning to pick up speed, and And in the early adoption phase of this, we haven't been necessarily super strategic about following that grasslands conservation model. So whereas I would like to see this work being done here in the shortgrass prairie ecoregion or the arid grasslands of the Chihuahuan Desert, you'll see that there's been a lot of work accomplished here and a bit accomplished here, which does fall within one of our strategic zones. But that's because we have to get this program up and running. We have to be able to meet demand, and we have to partner with markets that want to use their power of choice to purchase this beef. So right now we are in the early adoption phase, but here in the near term, I believe we'll be pivoting to a bigger focus on those really important priority grassland systems that we identified earlier. Here are some of our Texas market partners. So you can look at this slide, and I think this is going to be recorded, or anybody could reach out afterwards. I'd be really happy to share some of the websites for these producers. This is where you might be able to land some of this beef. We know that there's been a lot of success with this group right here, which is Blue Nest Beef. They are a subscription-based service that mails you your orders through the mail. So they're, as you can imagine, quite popular right now, since we're all at home and having to do most of our commerce online and through the mail. And Rome Ranch, I always like to mention Rome Ranch because Rome Ranch is these were the folks that created the Epic Bar, which is a really popular meat-based protein bar that was established here in Austin, and they sort of sold their company and then went and retired out near Fredericksburg and bought a ranch out there to raise grass-fed bison. And they were the first grass-fed bison ranch in the United States certified through our program. They do sell beef. They do not place the green seal on their bison meat right now, but you can find it under the trade name Force of Nature, or you can go directly to Rome Ranch to look them up if you're interested in supporting their operation. But all about holistic grazing and improving the range through the use and biomimicry of cattle and bison. I'll jump into Coast, and I'm keeping an eye on time. We'll probably got a few minutes left here. Coast is one of our deepest legacy programs. We've been operating a coastal program since 1905. You can see here a map of the 177 coastal islands, these rookery islands that Audubon, Texas has the responsibility of stewarding and managing for the benefit of colonial nesting waterbirds. And that's no small task considering that we have such a small staff. So I'll point out that we lean heavily on our partnerships, including our network, our Audubon network. We're wonderful fans of the work that Houston Audubon does in and around Galveston Bay. We're huge fans of the Gulf Coast Bird Observatory over near Freeport, the Coastal Bend Bay and Estuary program around Corpus Christi. It takes a village to get this work done. We have some great partnerships, and you know, this is again our legacy program, one of the programs that we can be most proud of. We have deep roots, and some of those roots are you know, the first island that we ever became stewards over was Green Island there in deep South Texas, and its significance is that it is the most important breeding colony site for reddish egrets in the entire United States. And if you look at this map here on the top, I'll illustrate where Green Island is. So this bigger circle here represents Green Island, and it's over 200 pairs that it supports every year. So there's your reddish egret doing its dance while it's hunting out there in the shallows. Here's Green Island. Apologize. Here is Green Island, and this is where all of the nesting occurs on this island, is in this wooded central area. But I want to kind of hone in on Matagorda Bay because Audubon, Texas has spent quite a bit of time over the last 2 years focusing in on this bay system because we believe that it is a critically important bay system. And we believe that because it has such great opportunity. It is, I'll just real quickly point out that all of these dots here represent, all of these red dots represent historic water breeding sites for water birds. Several of those sites no longer are active. They've either been flooded out or eroded away. So of the 7 that are shown up there, I believe that only 3 of them remain intact. I'll jump into that a little bit more in just a second. But we believe Matagorda Bay is such an important ecosystem and portion of the Texas coast because, well, first, it's the second largest bay system in Texas, or just right behind Galveston Bay. But it's also strategically placed between 2 of the most economically important bay systems and 2 of the most quickly developing bay systems in Galveston Bay and Corpus Christi Bay. So as you can imagine, you have a bay system here in Matagorda Bay that is less populated, less developed, although it certainly has its own pressures, particularly with some of the petrochemical and plastics industries. But it is largely intact and viable. And we believe that it is an essential ecosystem to preserve in case there's ever a natural disaster or human disaster in those other bay systems, that this system can serve as the seed source for a needed colonization sink. So this would be the source for that sink. And further, you know, we have some important assets in Matagorda Bay. Chester Island, formerly known as Sundown Island, is located right here off of the point of Port O'Connor. That's Port O'Connor. Here's Chester Island. This is the Matagorda Bay, Matagorda shipping channel. We also have, I didn't illustrate on this map, but if you come here, this is also the Gulf Intercoastal Waterway. So a pretty important site. This island was built from dredge materials when the Matagorda shipping channel was built. They put the spoils over here. It eventually sort of coalesced, firmed up, and that was built in about 1964. And you can see that there are all sorts of forces at play here, that this was an island that was placing, but you can tell that the bottom left is sort of corkscrewing this way. It's migrating that way. The top right is sort of wanting to go this way. So this island kind of moves and shakes due to all of the wave energy action, both from the shipping channel, the predominant southeastern winds, but it's largely intact. You can see that the vegetation centrally is varied and diverse, and that attracts a lot of wildlife. So we have quite a few challenges managing this island. It's about 77 acres. It's a really big island, Rookery Island. Let's see here. It's about 77 acres, and but as you can see in the photograph, we have some erosion issues, significant erosion issues that occur around this area and around this area here. So at any point, we lose about 20 to 30 feet interior due to erosion activity every year, and that same amount of sand and island can be lost in a single significant hurricane. So during Hurricane Harvey, we saw that 25-foot loss of habitat in that 3-day period. So we lost a total of about 7 acres to the island. We benefit from dredge placement, so they're continually maintaining the Matagorda shipping channel. So we'll get some of that material, and they'll come in and they'll place some more. Typically, they're placing here. We want some more here, but the central part of the island where most of the birds breed is fairly intact. We have a hard job of making sure that continues through the future. And I use this map. This is Karankawa Bay. This is a sub bay of Matagorda Bay. I use this map. It's kind of a time signature of those erosion processes. Very natural. We have well, I say it's natural. It's as natural as I guess it could be. It's a naturally occurring process, but it's influenced largely by climate change and the rising tides. And you can see, I want you to focus your attention here, these marshes. This picture's from the 1980s, I believe. So you got these marsh systems here, and you have this whole almost fully connected spit of land and shore that forms what is called Redfish Lake here. I'm going to go to today's picture. And you can see that during the course of about 40 years, there's been a significant loss of shoreline. We've lost a lot of marsh habitat, which supports some pretty important species. And so these are things that we're dealing with regularly in the coast. And that's why I mentioned earlier that of those 7 active colonies, water bird colonies that I showed earlier, we've lost over half of those in Matagorda Bay due to these sorts of things. And these conditions provide challenges, especially to some of the beach nesting birds. And I'll jump into that in just a second. We also chose Matagorda Bay because like much of the coast, it's filled with really important species. So I've got a few here: the whooping crane, red knot, piping plover, and black rail. And all of these are protected federally as either endangered or threatened species. Well, I think black rail hasn't gotten its status certified yet, but it's going to be a threatened species. And all of 4 of those species occur in goodly numbers in Matagorda Bay. But we also note that there are some species of great conservation need that are declining significantly, both within Texas and across the range. And those are the American oyster catcher up there at the top left, and black skimmer bottom right. And these are birds that seem to be suffering due to a couple of afflictions. Certainly, both of these are beach nesting birds, so that as we're experiencing more intense storms, rising tides, and all of these other situations, they're finding their habitat washed over during that critical breeding period. But additionally, we're seeing increased recreation and use and disturbance and human activity. These birds don't have to flush very many times before they'll either abandon the colony or they'll suffer from predation. And certainly we see this happen at time with crested caracara that like to nest on Chester Island, at least with the black skimmers. So a little bit more about Chester Island. It's probably one of the most important water bird colony breeding sites within at least the mid-coast. And I think that's well illustrated here by the map, the color-coded map here that represents, each one of those dots represents a pair of a particular species. For instance, there's about 20 species that breed on this island, but each one of those dots is a breeding occurrence. And our most recent counts, so I know that the chart only goes through 2017, but our most recent counts in 2018 and 19 have put us over 20,000 pairs of birds breeding on this 77 acres. And that's why it's really important to think that even though that these islands are rather small in footprint, they're huge in impact to conservation to those species of birds. I mean, if we were to think about 20,000 pairs of wood warblers in central Texas, we would be talking about a pretty significant amount of acreage, and all of that could occur right here on a single island of 77 acres. Last, I'll point out that that in Matagorda Bay, I've got 5 pins highlighted here. Audubon Texas has been looking at creating, and I'm going to point out with my laser pointer, this is where Chester Island is. Audubon has been working on trying to create redundancy and resiliency within Matagorda Bay. So we're focused, we are significantly focused on continuing to manage Chester Island and keep track of our birds there, and to make sure that we provide resiliency opportunities so that the island doesn't continuously wash away. We're working right now with the U.S. Corps of Engineers to develop a plan. We're working on funding mechanisms to underwrite getting more significant amounts of dredge and the sand that they use, that they capture during the dredging process, and placing it in and around the island in a way that slows down erosive processes and provides a buffer to that important beach nesting and interior vegetation, which is the shrub and trees nesting habitat. In addition to that, the second part of the plan, the first part of the plan is always protect what you have, what you know you got. And then the second part of the plan is to create redundancy so that if anything were to ever happen there, or if we want to try to increase the population of some of these birds within Matagorda Bay, we create more breeding habitat. And that seems to be the bottleneck within Matagorda Bay. The bay itself is healthy. It's got plenty of food resources. And there's lots of birds, primarily focused over there on Chester Island. So the bottleneck truly seems to be breeding sites. And we've identified five sites here on this map that we're looking at. We're at varying levels of feasibility in trying to progress a plan to build new islands that would be built in, with armaments to significantly slow down erosive actions, and to provide favorable breeding habitat for these birds. And two sites, this one here in Espiritu Santo and right here at Gulf Cut, we have actually taken to the point where we are working towards finalizing some funding for the final permitting and engineering and design, which would allow us to then pursue funding for actually building the island. So we're actually through about 3 of the 5 gates to get this work done. The other one that seems to be pretty viable is up here around the mouth of Karankawa Bay. Another really strong opportunity there. And not to downplay the opportunities with East Matagorda Shoal or Oyster Farm over here in the lower part of East Matagorda Bay, but that these are sort of the priority projects that have a lot of support because of the birds that these islands could be built for, the particular species, but also because they're easiest associated with existing dredge material infrastructure along the coast and providing resiliency to some of the communities. So this, at Karankawa Bay mouth could provide some protections to private property and communities in and around Karankawa Bay. So the last thing I'll say is I wish I had another hour to talk. I mean, it's always so fun to talk about the work that you're doing and the diversity of Texas. But I'll wrap it up by mentioning that Matagorda Bay and those shortgrass prairies that we were focused up there in the Panhandle, where we're focusing a lot of our effort, are tied by the liquid heart that is the Colorado River. And this is the same river that runs through our very city and our backyard, and some of that critical habitat that supports our emblematic endemic breeding golden-cheeked warbler. So this is the tie that binds, and this is one of our 3 priority basins for our water work and our water strategy. I just don't have enough time to talk about it today, but I wanted to mention that there are other strategies and other tools that we're working on, but these were the ones I wanted to talk about tonight. With that, I'll end the talk. I'll thank you. And there's a picture of a lone peregrine sitting on Bolivar Flats over there towards the coast, a place that I haven't seen. I miss really bad right now. And I thank you for your time. I really appreciate it, everybody.
Thank you, Romey. Thank you so much. There's been a couple of questions that have come in so far, and I will ask some of those. I'll be the moderator. And if you have other questions, you can go ahead and add them to the chat, and we'll get through as many as we can in the next few minutes. Romey, one question was, is Chester Island a restricted access area?
Yes, it is. It's technically The leases that we have for these islands are, the islands are owned by the General Land Office, which means that they are held in trust for the public, that they are technically publicly accessible, but our leases allow for us to enforce trespass during the breeding season. And the breeding season at Chester lasts from about February through the end of August. So, but a lot of the locals are, we've got a warden that works out of Port O'Connor, and oversees the stewardship and management of that island, but he's got a community around him, including the fishing community that really see it as that's the bird island.
Great. There's a question about asking if you could describe what restorative grazing is, how it works.
Yeah, restorative grazing it's an effort to utilize cattle and livestock to serve like as biomimicry of what bison and large herbivores probably acted like within a functional and intact Great Plains ecosystem historically. And what we have seen over the last 100 years is that a lot of our grasslands and rangelands have either been converted to farming or they've been grazed to the point where they're not acting like healthy grasslands that they once were. And that's because, you put fences up, you have a large group of cattle grazing the same plot for continuously. And you have operators that work under pressures that this is their livelihood. They have to they have to produce cattle to be able to stay viable on their land. Otherwise, I don't think anybody would really be making those tough decisions. But the idea is that if you are to increase the number, the density of those cattle, but move them quickly, so you let them have a lot of pressure on a small area, and then you move them, and then you move them, and then you move them. You can with enough acreage, you create a system where the same square of land won't see that high pressure for a year and a half, 2 years. And a lot of that, when you bring in regenerative grazing, when you bring the animals back in, you let the land tell you. You say, okay, the vegetation is sufficiently recovered. It's now appropriate to graze this. But it introduces the bacteria from the poop and the hoof pressure from the stomping of these cattle, and it breaks up all the compaction. So there's a lot of processes that are occurring that replicate a system that was probably intact, 150 years ago and essential to the grasslands. Conversely, you can't recover, in most cases, you can't recover a grassland just by taking cattle off of it. It's just not going to work that way. It has to have that catalyst to spark. Otherwise, you have grasses grow up, they die, and nothing's there to eat them. You got to either wait for fire, which some of these ecosystems, lots of these ecosystems were driven by fire, but some of them weren't. And quite frankly, that doesn't take care of all of it, because right behind fire, you have issues with erosion. So the cattle are seen as a tool. Private lands are the dominant lands within Texas, and if you're going to engage in grasslands conservation, you're going to have to work with your producers and landowners. And so this is a great strategy for that strip of Midwestern states that is largely privately owned.
Great, thank you. There's a question about if there has been increased bird activity or nesting activity since the beaches have been shut down for the pandemic.
Well, I wish I could answer that, but we have been shut down for the pandemic. I do have some indications that at Green Island, so our warden has a boat that he has a dock to his house, a canal that he's like 10 minutes from Green Island. So he's still tending Green Island. I've gotten favorable reports that the spoonbills have already started to nest there. The great blues were there in goodly numbers early, and that the scouts for the reddish egrets were already showing up.
Great. I want to ask, there's so many pressures on birds, just the evidence of how much populations have declined. It can be a little overwhelming. If people want to know one thing, if you were going to make a recommendation for one thing that the average person could do that you feel like makes a real impact for birds and their habitat, what is like an easy thing that you would recommend for people who care about that? I
would say that, I'm going to put my personal opinion into this, but I would say just share your passion, continue to educate yourself, and engage in those community science opportunities and volunteer opportunities. And there's a lot of things that we can do. And I think that just like every person's motivations are personal, like why you care, why, you know, how to answer the question, why should I care? I think that's a very individual, there's a different answer for almost every individual. For every individual, there's a different way to engage effectively. I think I found my call, you know, diving in and committing to a career in conservation. I think I've kind of figured out some skill sets that I had, some interests that I had, and I let them kind of teach me to be here. But everybody's got a different skill set. Everybody's got a different personal motivation. And I think that just jumping in, but also I think it's about making sure that the stories get told, and that you got to know your audience, because coming in, swinging for the fences with a very conservative group that's skeptical of things and thinks about processes and investments in a different way, they're not going to hear you. But a soft intro might open up a door that we can later enter. So knowing your audience, sharing your passion, and just knowing what your skills and where the needs are locally.
Great. Speaking of personal stories, I want to know what your spark bird is. What was the bird that got you interested in knowing more about birds?
Oh, well, you know,
It's your spark herp also. You can talk
well, I
about
was going to say that my spark bird would probably be a spark herp. The whole reason that I got into birding was because I was performing a master's thesis at Palmetto State Park over here near Gonzales, and I was focused on resurveying all the reptiles and amphibians of the Atene wetlands, which are right there in Palmetto. And when you're doing a scientific study, it's important to be consistent in your method, in your study intervals and your methodology, which meant that I had to be out surveying reptiles and amphibians during the winter when there were no reptiles or amphibians that were active. And that's a boring job. So what you notice is that there's a lot of things moving around. You're out in beautiful God's country. There's a lot of things moving around in these trees that have no leaves on. And you're already a biologist, so you own binoculars, you just don't use them. So I just started picking them up and looking up there, and you know, eventually bought a field guide and started moving. So I think there was a lot of birds that I got to know. Probably the first bird song that I got to know and found familiar and enjoyed was the northern parula. And the first challenging bird ID where I felt like I think I will become a birder was the red-eyed vireo. First I had to find that sucker singing up there and then try to figure out what it was. And those were both at Palmetto. Now I've since then had tons of things. My favorite Texas bird is probably the painted redstart. And that's because not only because it's an incredibly gorgeous bird. I'm a sucker for the black, white, red combo. But when you're seeing that bird in Texas, you're also in some of the most beautiful and iconic spaces, and experiencing probably some of the most storied conservation successes that we have.
That's great. That's inspiring, Romey. Thank you so much. We've already had some requests in the chat for a second talk, so you can start preparing that now. Everybody wants to hear more about your work and just the variety of habitats and the birds that we host here in Texas. It's so great to hear all about it. But
I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you.
We'll go ahead and wrap up. We're really glad that all of you were able to join us. Romey has his contact information in his slide set. We'll share the recording and his information and everything that was presented this evening on our website, so you can look out for that. But we'll go ahead and sign off. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a real pleasure to be with you tonight. And thank you to Romey. It was a great evening.
Thanks you all. I was thrilled to be with you. This was so much fun.
Thank you.
See you outside eventually.
Yeah. Be well. Bye-bye.
Bye, Nicole.